they weren't just taking risks. They were chasing moments of thrill, shortcuts, and stunts. 6 ordinary choices, each meant to impress, entertain, or save time, but ended in disaster. One reckless move was enough to cost a life. These are the final moments of people whose lives ended in the most tragically stupid ways. It was March 11, 2016 in Chicago, Illinois. The 10th floor of a college dorm was full of noise that Friday night. Music came from the halls, students walked in and out of rooms, and groups met to drink and talk. Jason Morris, a 21-year-old student in his second year, was there too. He was not known for sports or schoolwork, but around the dorm he had made a different kind of name for himself. Jason was the one who would take chances. He had climbed onto roofs, slid down stair rails, and even stepped out onto ledges before, all to get a reaction from friends. That night, Jason was with a group of students in his room. Music played, and drinks were being shared. The talk turned to stunts, and someone said how he had once climbed between windows before. The idea quickly became a dare. Some students told him not to, but others laughed and pushed him to do it. Phones were taken out, and the pressure to perform grew. Sure of himself as always, Jason moved toward the window to prove he could do it again. He opened the window and stepped out. The ledge outside was thin, only a few inches wide, just enough space to balance a shoe. Jason pressed his back hard against the brick wall and began sliding sideways, moving toward the next window. The students inside made loud sounds, some calling for him to stop while others cheered and filmed. From the yard and street below, a few people walking by saw movement high above and pointed up. Jason made it halfway across before things went bad. As he lifted his right foot toward the other window frame, he lost his balance. His shoe slipped on the ledge, and his weight moved forward. In a second, he lost his footing. His body dropped, but his hands caught the thin metal frame of the window. For several seconds, he hung 10 floors above the yard. People who saw it later said they heard the scraping sound of his shoes against the wall as he kicked, trying to find a hold. Students inside the dorm screamed. One classmate leaned out, reaching as far as he could, but Jason was just out of reach. The crowd in the room grew louder, some yelling directions, others frozen in fear. A few people dropped their phones in panic, while others kept filming, not sure what else to do. His grip lasted only moments. The smooth metal frame gave him nothing solid to hold on to. His fingers slipped, and then he was gone. Students at the window watched as Jason fell straight down into the yard. The sound of the hit was sharp, followed by a wave of screams from the rooms above. Some students ran into the hall to get help, while others stood frozen at the window, unable to look away. Down below, people walking by who had been watching rushed to the scene. They tried to reach Jason but quickly saw he was not responding. Within minutes, campus security officers came and pushed the crowd back. They called for paramedics and tried to secure the area. When emergency crews reached him, Jason was still. There was nothing more they could do. The following week, Jason's funeral was held in his hometown just outside Chicago. Friends, family, and classmates filled the small church. Many spoke about his humor and energy, but several also said that he often went too far when trying to entertain. The ceremony was quiet, and for those who had been in the room that night, the memory of the fall was still fresh. In the weeks after, the college leaders moved quickly to address safety concerns. Windows were made stronger with extra locks, and new warnings were posted across campus housing. Staff held meetings about the dangers of risky dares, especially when alcohol and peer pressure were involved. Officials said that what happened to Jason was a reminder of how quickly one bad choice could turn into disaster. For those who had watched from just a few feet away, the image of him hanging onto that window frame remained a lasting and haunting memory. It was July 22, 2017, in Phoenix, Arizona. The heat that afternoon had gone above 100 degrees, and the desert air moved with warmth. On the edge of the city, where paved roads turned into dusty paths and rocky lookouts, cars often stopped so people could take in the wide view. Among the drivers that day was 19-year-old Emily Roberts, who had just gotten her first car. Emily was known by her friends for posting often on Instagram. She liked to take photos of her car, her clothes, and her daily life. Friends later said she often reached for her phone even while driving, wanting to add to her collection of posts. On that July afternoon, she asked two friends to ride with her to a desert lookout. The spot gave a clear view of the valley and the rocky cliffs, and she thought it would make the perfect background for a new picture. The group got to the lookout around mid-afternoon. Emily pulled her car close to the edge, leaving the engine running. The car was still in gear, and she kept her foot pressed against the brake pedal. From the driver's side window, she leaned outward with her phone to line up the shot. People who saw it said she seemed focused on angling the photo to include both herself and the desert scenery behind her. As she leaned farther out of the window, her foot slipped from the brake. The car began to inch forward. Startled, she pressed down again, but her foot landed on the gas pedal instead. The car jumped forward, moving quickly in only a few yards. People nearby heard her friends scream as the car rolled toward the edge. With no safety rail in place, the car crossed the dirt line and launched straight over. The drop was close to 100 feet. The car hit the rocky slope below with a crash that echoed back up to the lookout. Glass broke, metal twisted, and the car tumbled before settling in a cloud of dust at the bottom. Emily's two friends rushed to the edge and then climbed down the slope. People who saw it said they stumbled on loose rocks as they made their way down. When they reached the bottom, the car was crushed. The roof had caved in, the airbags had blown up, and Emily was not responding inside. People nearby called emergency services, and within minutes, first responders came to the scene. Paramedics checked the wreck, but there was nothing more they could do. News of the crash spread quickly. The following week, Emily Roberts' funeral was held in Phoenix. Family, classmates, and neighbors filled the church seats. On the memorial table, her parents placed her graduation photo and the keys to her car. Friends who spoke at the service described how she had always been active and social, though many also said she often took risks with her phone while driving. Local authorities later talked about the crash as part of a bigger warning about distracted driving. They pointed out that selfie-related deaths had been going up in recent years, with dozens of cases reported around the world. Emily's death was included as an example in safety campaigns, with officials saying that even a brief loss of focus behind the wheel could lead to tragedy. For those who had been at the lookout that afternoon, the memory stayed clear. They remembered the sound of the tires shifting on gravel, the screams of her friends, and the sight of the car going over the edge. What began as a quick stop for a photo ended in disaster, becoming another reminder of how a single mistake can have permanent results. It was July 4th, 2015 in Houston, Texas. The streets of a neighborhood were filled with families celebrating the holiday. Grills filled the air with smoke, children waved sparklers, and groups of adults gathered outside their homes. Among the crowd was 23-year-old Anthony Garcia, a warehouse worker known to his friends as the one who always took chances. People often said he never turned down a dare, especially when alcohol was involved. That evening, Anthony was with his girlfriend and a group of neighbors at a block party. Fireworks were being set off in the street, with loud bursts echoing between the houses. Some people watched from their porches, while others stood closer to the makeshift launch area. Anthony joined in, laughing and joking as he picked up one of the large mortar-style fireworks. Mortars were powerful devices, designed to be placed in a tube on the ground. When lit, they launched shells high into the sky where they exploded in bright colors. Anthony, however, decided to hold the tube himself. According to people who saw it, he said he was going to press it against his chest while it launched. His girlfriend told him not to do it, and several neighbors yelled for him to stop. Despite the warnings, a number of people pulled out their phones to record what they thought would be another reckless stunt. Anthony lit the fuse. The crowd watched as the sparks traveled down into the tube. In seconds, the firework blasted upward with great force. The kickback drove the tube hard against his chest, and the blast went off at close range. People who saw it described seeing a blinding flash of light followed right away by a loud boom. Anthony fell instantly onto the pavement. The phone recording stopped as screams filled the street. Some people dropped what they were holding, while others rushed forward to try to help. His girlfriend knelt beside him, yelling for help. while neighbors tried to push back the smoke and debris. Children were hurried away by their parents as panic spread across the block. Within minutes, emergency services were called to the scene. Neighbors tried CPR while waiting for paramedics, but it was clear that the damage had been very bad. When the first responders arrived, they quickly confirmed that there was nothing more they could do. The celebration turned into chaos as police and medical crews secured the area. News of the accident spread across the neighborhood and beyond. Anthony Garcia's funeral was held a week later, drawing hundreds of people from the community. Friends, family, and co-workers came to pay their respects, many still in shock at how a moment of carelessness had ended so suddenly. His family asked that the phone videos never be shared, wanting to prevent further pain from the images of his final moments. Local authorities later talked about the case during public safety announcements. They reminded residents that fireworks were not toys and that mishandling them was both illegal and deadly. Officials explained how mortar shells were designed to be held steady in grounded tubes, not held by hand, and that the force of the launch could be fatal. Anthony's death was described as a preventable tragedy and became an example used in Houston's yearly firework safety campaigns. For those who were present that night, the memory was hard to forget. The sound of the explosion, the sudden quiet that followed, and the sight of neighbors rushing forward all remained clear in their minds. What was meant to be a celebration of independence had ended in disaster, showing how a single reckless act could change a community in an instant. It was October 14, 2018, in Brooklyn, New York. The city was wet from steady rain that had fallen throughout the evening. Umbrellas crowded the sidewalks, and the smell of wet pavement carried down into the subway stations. At one of the platforms, 27-year-old Malik Hassan waited for his train. He had been working long hours at a local restaurant, and friends later said he often joked about finding shortcuts to avoid delays. Among those jokes was the risky idea of crossing the tracks to catch a train on the opposite side. That night, the platform was crowded with people shaking water from their coats. The arrival board showed that Malik's train had just pulled away, and the next one would take several minutes. People who saw it said that he grew impatient and walked toward the edge of the platform. Ignoring the yellow safety strip, he looked down at the rails, then at the opposite side where another train was expected soon. Without waiting, he jumped down from the platform onto the tracks. The sound of his shoes hitting the wet metal drew gasps from those nearby. Several people shouted for him to climb back up. One woman yelled directly at him to stop, while others waved their arms. Malik instead began running across the tracks, his feet splashing against puddles of rainwater that had pooled in the channel. Halfway across, his shoe slipped on the slick rail. He stumbled, got his balance, and tried to push forward. At that same moment, the glare of headlights appeared at the far end of the tunnel. The rumble of an approaching train grew louder, shaking the walls. People who saw it later said Malik looked back, then tried to scramble up to the far platform. As he lifted himself, his foot became caught near loose trash and wiring in the track bed. Paper, plastic, and a piece of loose wiring tangled near his ankle. He pulled, but the movement slowed him. A few people on the opposite platform reached down, stretching their arms to grab him. They yelled at him to hold on, but the train was closing in too quickly. The roar of the subway car filled the tunnel. Several people turned away, unable to watch. Others covered their mouths or cried out as the train barreled through. In the seconds that followed, the platform fell into silence except for the screech of brakes and the shouts of panicked people. Transit workers quickly moved to stop service on the line. Police and paramedics rushed into the station within minutes, forcing the crowd back. The rescue team worked under the train, but it was already too late. Malik Hassan had not survived the impact. News of the accident spread quickly across the neighborhood. Malik's funeral was held a few days later at a small mosque in Brooklyn. Family members, co-workers, and neighbors filled the prayer hall. The service was quiet, with relatives standing in silence as prayers were recited. His co-workers from the restaurant attended, many of them in shock that a shortcut attempt had ended so tragically. In the weeks following the incident, transit officials spoke about the dangers of track trespassing. They explained that trains could not stop quickly once in motion, especially in wet conditions. Announcements were broadcast across stations reminding riders never to step onto the tracks under any circumstances. Patrols were also increased at busy subway stops, with officers watching more closely during peak hours. For those who had been on the platform that rainy night, the scene was unforgettable. They remembered the sound of shoes hitting metal, the shouts to stop, and the blinding headlights of the oncoming train. What began as a rushed decision to save time ended with a fatal mistake, reinforcing how dangerous even a few seconds on the tracks could be. It was April 9th, 2016, in Los Angeles, California. The city was alive with weekend activity, with people filling the sidewalks, cars lining the streets, and the sound of traffic carrying between tall buildings downtown. On one of those rooftops stood 24-year-old Carlos Vega, a part-time retail worker who spent most of his free hours practicing parkour. Friends said he had been training for years, often climbing structures, jumping over rails, and filming himself for short YouTube videos. His channel had only a handful of followers, but he kept recording, hoping to grow his audience with more daring stunts. That evening, Carlos and two friends got access to the roof of a downtown apartment building. The roof was flat, with patches of tar and scattered debris, lined by a waist-high ledge. From there, the view stretched across the city, but Carlos had something else in mind. He pointed toward a nearby structure just across the street. Between the two rooftops was a gap measuring about 12 feet. People who saw it later said Carlos told his friends he wanted to try to jump across and capture it on video. One of his friends strongly objected, warning him it was too risky. The other hesitated but kept holding the camera. Carlos insisted, moving back to create a short running start. His shoes scraped against the gravel as he lined himself up, preparing to run toward the edge. The camera began recording, pointed squarely at him. Carlos ran forward. People who saw it said he pumped his arms and shouted as he reached the ledge. At the last second, his foot hit the edge of the roof, cutting his distance short. Instead of clearing the 12-foot gap, his body struck the wall of the opposite building. His hands reached out, clawing for a hold, but the smooth surface gave him nothing to grip. In an instant, he slipped downward into the alley below. His friends screamed from the rooftop. The camera fell to the ground, capturing only the sound of footsteps as they raced toward the stairwell. People on the street below had already seen the fall. Several called 911, while others rushed into the alley. When Carlos's friends reached the ground level, they found bystanders gathered around the spot where he had landed. Emergency crews arrived within minutes, but paramedics quickly confirmed that the injuries were fatal. Carlos Vega had died instantly from the impact. News of the accident spread quickly through his community. Carlos's funeral was held a week later, attended by relatives, classmates, and neighbors. Friends remembered him for his constant focus on physical challenges and his fascination with what he called big stunts. At the request of his family, his small YouTube channel was quietly deleted after his death. In the weeks that followed, the Los Angeles Police Department increased patrols in downtown areas where rooftops were known to be accessed illegally. Officials warned about the dangers of urban stunts, reminding the public that rooftops were not designed for recreation and that falls were often fatal. Safety notices were also placed in several apartment complexes, cautioning residents and visitors not to attempt rooftop jumps or record dangerous videos. For those who had been there that night, the memory was lasting. They recalled the sound of his shoes striking the gravel, the sudden silence after the fall, and the frantic rush down the stairwell. What began as an attempt to capture a dramatic video ended with a fatal plunge, showing again how quickly a stunt meant for the internet could end in tragedy. It was December 16, 2017, in rural Kentucky. The night was cold, with frost covering the fields and a clear sky overhead. In a small town, a group of young adults gathered in a barn for a weekend party. The space was dimly lit, with music from a radio echoing off the wooden walls. Beer bottles lined a table, and voices carried through the open doors into the night. Among the group was 29-year-old Derek Lawson, who had grown up in the town and was known locally for his reckless behavior. Friends later said he often collected old guns and enjoyed showing them off at gatherings. That evening, Derek arrived with a revolver. It was an older model he had bought from a pawn shop, and he had carried it in a bag. At first, the party continued normally, with people drinking and talking. But after a while, Derek pulled the revolver from the bag. He spun the cylinder in his hand and made comments about playing Russian roulette. People who saw it said that his cousin right away told him to put it away, warning him not to go through with it. Others at the party laughed nervously, unsure if he was being serious. A few people pulled out their phones expecting him to be joking, while others moved closer to watch. The music kept playing, and the barn filled with tension as Derek set the revolver against his head. He pulled the trigger once. The hammer fell with a loud click, but no shot fired. Several people gasped, and some laughed out of shock. Derek spun the cylinder again, raising the revolver a second time. Before anyone could stop him, he pulled the trigger. This time, the gun went off. The sound of the shot echoed inside the barn. Derek fell backward onto the ground. The revolver dropped onto the wooden floor beside him. Panic broke out instantly. Bottles crashed to the floor as people scrambled in every direction. Some ran outside into the cold night air, while others rushed toward Derek. A few partygoers shouted for someone to call 911. Within minutes, the local emergency services were called. Several partygoers tried CPR, but the damage was too severe. Deputies and paramedics arrived at the barn shortly afterward. The area was secured, and Derek was pronounced dead at the scene. News of the incident spread quickly across the small town. Derek Lawson's funeral was held a few days later, attended mostly by family members and a few longtime friends. The service was private, with his relatives asking that the circumstances of his death not be widely discussed. Neighbors respected their wishes, and many avoided bringing up the details in public. Local sheriffs later talked about the case indirectly during school assemblies and community events. They spoke about the dangers of guns and stressed that weapons were not toys. Officers explained that games with real guns had led to tragedies before, and this case was another example of how quickly things could go wrong. They urged residents to treat all guns as loaded and to secure them properly. For those who had been in the barn that night, the memory stayed vivid. They remembered the sound of the cylinder spinning, the click of the empty chamber, and the sudden crack of the second shot. The chaos that followed, with people shouting, phones dropping, and footsteps rushing across the wooden floor, left a mark on everyone present. What began as a party in a rural barn ended with silence and shock, a reminder that reckless stunts with guns often have fatal consequences. Thanks for watching, but remember, every risk has its price. The next story is already waiting on the end screen. Click it if you're ready to witness another final moment.